We're going to get started with that pre-migration planning, and I'm going to bring in Jeremy here from Kickdrum. Jeremy, how do you know if you're ready to migrate to the cloud? And what do you want to consider if you're a company thinking about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really the place that you want to start. There's a lot of things that go into planning for migration. But at first, I would start with what is the objective that you have with this migration? What's your business objective, not just technology, but what are you trying to accomplish for the business? Is it increasing your profitability through scalable applications? Is it something to do with an exit that you have planned? Or are you looking at maybe security as part of it? That's really going to be the driving factor behind everything. Once you've done that, we'll start to look at things like what does your current infrastructure look like? How much are you spending on the servers that you have if you're in a data center, where they are in their life cycle, any sort of limitations that you might have around licensing or other considerations like that that would prevent you from making that move to the cloud. And then we want to talk about your cost and your budget consideration. That's not just for when you get to the cloud, but during the move process. One thing to keep in mind when we're talking about a migration is that you're going to have a hurdle. You're going to have a time where you're paying for some servers in your data center or your old cloud provider while also paying for the cloud provider that you've selected. So that's going to be a bubble that you're going to have. Now, there are funding opportunities through AWS to reduce that cost during that time period, but it's something you need to consider. And of course, you have the operational component of that, the project cost to move into AWS or really into any cloud provider. So you need to make sure that you're properly forecasting that. Finally, we've got things like security and compliance, GDPR, HIPAA compliance, any sort of customer agreements that you have, you need to make sure that you are clear on what your legal obligation is, both in terms of storing data, but also in terms of notifying your customers about any change in your infrastructure that you have planned. So, those are a few things that I would start to consider when you get in place. The other thing that I would say, a little bit selfishly, but I would recommend working with a partner who's gone through this before and can guide you through the right questions to ask.
Cost is such an important part of any of these projects. And oftentimes, cost is what starts the conversation about whether you should migrate or not. We see a lot of customers that kind of get pushed to do this maybe a little bit earlier than they're ready to do that. Is it better for these customers to just get in the cloud and then worry about optimizing it later? Or is there other ways to be thinking about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly it's one of the first things that you want to think about as well. Am I going to do what we would call a lift and shift? Or am I going to do something where I'm what we would call modernizing as we're moving into the cloud? So, a couple of case studies I can talk through about this to maybe give you some parameters to think about it in your situation. The first one was for a healthcare provider. They had a lot of their users that were using instances in a data center that they had spun up, where it would be things like development work or even essentially workstations that people would telecommute into. In that situation, that's a pretty straightforward lift and shift. We can use tools like AWS's Migration Evaluator to do analysis on that, understand what the systems are that are being used, what their utilization is, things like that, so that we have a very clear picture of what's being used today. And we can map that to what you would use in a cloud provider like AWS. We can then move you over entirely and we can apply some cost saving measures at that time. And you're likely going to see some savings right out of the gate with that. But I'll be honest, more often than not, we see companies regret doing a lift and shift migration. Instead, it's usually better to plan how you're going to optimize those workloads before you move into the cloud. Now, that doesn't mean doing the modernization first. It means making sure you have a plan to do that modernization and sticking with it. I'll talk to you about a client that we're actually engaged with right now, who they planned to spend about $20 million a year in their data center. They did a lift and shift. They moved over, and now they're actually on track to spend about $30 million a year,
Ooh.
which Yeah, you can imagine that's a bit of a rude awakening to see that bill start to come in. And really, what's happening with that is that they're seeing things like inter-region data traffic has spiked more than they had planned for, and a lot of these expenses that you don't think of that might be outside of just the server itself. So that's a situation where they really should have spent more time planning and optimizing before they made the move. And luckily, they called us, and we're coming in to make some changes to their environment and make sure we can get that spend under control.
That's great. What are some of the complicating factors in migration that you've seen with different customers? Is it mostly having to deal with refactoring, or are there other concerns like coming from another cloud, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, a few years ago, we had a customer named Acoustic. They were part of IBM Marketing Cloud. I think they're a great example of doing a lot of planning in advance. This is a major complicating factor because they're a marketing company. They have a lot of concerns about the reliability of the platform when you're talking about serving web ads or sending emails or things like that. And they're dealing with massive data sets. If you think about segmentation in the marketing world, you're looking at a ton of data about each customer and then trying to make sure that you're targeting them correctly. So, what we did in that scenario was our planning actually involved doing several proof of concept database deployments across different vendors in order to determine the best price performance. And I emphasize price in that because there's a trade-off decision to be made with the performance and with the cost of obtaining that performance. So we did that. We looked at Redshift. We looked at a few other systems that were available to us, and ultimately were able to make some very good comparisons running millions of data records against a mock environment in that proof of concept and determine exactly what they would need to do. And they made a move to the cloud that reduced their costs substantially. I will note with them as well, another complicating factor that you'll see plenty of places is that they were coming from another cloud provider. So in that situation, we need to not only understand what's the right target infrastructure for them to be on in that database proof of concept model, but also what are some of the commitments that they have in place? Do they have a minimum spend commitment?
Right.
Do they have some licensing commitments? What's the timeline for them to exit? And they, in fact, had some commitments in place. They were able to negotiate a shorter run on some of those commitments, but also just had to understand that that was going to be part of the trade-off when they made this migration. Luckily, the outcome was that they saved enough money that it was worth it for them to make that move a little bit sooner and be properly set up to deploy in that environment.
So important to be considering all of these factors while you are planning before you commit to a migration. Despite the pressures, the cost pressures that are out there, definitely take the time to plan. And if you want a partner to plan with, certainly take a look at kickdrum.com, contact us and see if there's anything we can do to help you.